Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some PathOfExile 1 discussion. Patch 3.26.0D does not at first look like it's got anything much in it. However, the devil is in the details. This is one of the biggest interventions into a trade league that I think we've ever seen from Grinding Gear Games. So let's start out with what the minor stuff is at the start. There's a bunch of things related to Mercenaries League. We're definitely not going to go through all of this. A couple of worthy fixes like nerfs to the amount of damage that Shield Crush does when an enemy mercenary is using it, or nerfs to the amount of damage that an enemy mercenary does with Exsanguinate or Static Strike, a whole bunch of other sorts of skills along those lines. Pretty minor stuff. Then there's a couple of minor fixes that relate to challenges in 3.26, worthy fixes, but nothing that people would really notice, except for it just removing one little irritation that comes up late in the league. However, we then look down and we see the big two major lines. One of them is a change to the Orb of Unravelling, mechanical change to the way that players have discovered that it works. And the second one, much more significant, is a change to the way that 8 modifier corruptions work. So, originator influenced maps, these are going to no longer drop when they're dropped by the 8 mod corruption Scarab. They're no longer going to drop with 8 guaranteed tier 17 mods. What does this mean? Well, tier 17 map mods, they just add more loot than the regular map mods do. They add more danger usually than the normal map mods pool as well, but they add quite a lot more loot. And so all of the maps that are generated in the future as 8 modifier tier 16.5s, they're going to be weaker than the ones that were generated during week 2. And they're going to generate less loot than the ones that were created during week 2 as well. It's been interesting talking with people over on the PathOfExile 1 subreddit. A lot of people have been saying this is something Grinding Gear Games always do, and exploit early, exploit often, or miss out entirely. I don't actually think that's really the case. The recent practice along these lines has been to leave a lot of these major bugs in until the end of the league. To take an example, in patch 3.23 Affliction League, the league's economy was completely dominated by a bug/exploit, whatever you want to call it, that involves Stygian Spires spawning more loot-generating monsters if they fired more projectiles. And so what this meant was that players were incentivized to spec into Abyss and also to grant additional projectiles via any means available to these Stygian Spires. The only thing Grinding Gear Games addressed during the actual 3.23 league itself was the private league modifier that granted multiple projectiles to all monsters in the entire game, because this was generating more loot and it ended up being a paid advantage. But all of the other uses of this bug/exploit to generate more loot, all of them were left in play for the entirety of patch 3.23. Exactly the same thing happened in Phrecia League as well. In Phrecia League, there was a Rogue Exile related idol mod that stacked quadratically with more copies of itself. So if you had one copy of the idol mod, it had 1 times the effect. If you had 2 copies of it, then each one had double effect. So it was like you had 4 times the effect. If you had 3 copies of this mod, then you ended up with 9 times the effect. And if you had the maximum possible 4 copies of this mod, you ended up with 16 times the effect. Essentially, this particular modifier double dipped, and this completely transformed the entirety of the Trade League economy. However, while it was noticeable that Affliction League was popular with a lot of players, this was not the case the second time one of these very similar sorts of bugs/exploits that just generated a lot more loot came about. And Phrecia League ended up really falling off in popularity pretty soon after this bug/exploit was discovered and was widely communicated around the player base. So with that in mind, Grinding Gear Games have decided, no, we're not having it again in 3.26, and they've decided they're going to intervene. Some people are going to love this, some people are going to hate this, and I do think a lot of people are going to say this is terrible because it generates a legacy wealth gap, and if I wanted a legacy wealth gap, I would play in Standard. For those of you that aren't familiar with Standard, there's a couple of really broken items that exist there that were actually quite easy to get at various points in PathOfExile's history, like the first incarnation of the Vessel of Vinctar unique flask. This is arguably the single most powerful item that's ever existed in PathOfExile 1, and that's when you consider its value over a replacement item in a build. This thing is absolutely off the charts broken. It pretty much makes it so that you can't die except to being one shot. 30% of lightning damage leached as both life and mana during the effect, and life and mana leech are instant during the effect. This applies to spells as well as applying to attacks. It is just off the charts, the level of power that this item has. This is something that was relatively easy to get your hands on at one point in PathOfExile's history, but now no more of them can exist. For some people, this is the appeal of standard. There's a section of the player base that like the fear of missing out / pride in not having missed out, that this sort of concept of legacy items and legacy wealth, that this really gels for. However, there's also a lot of players that really cannot stand it, and I think it is the case that it is the majority that prefer something that's more of a level playing field, which is why standard exists and why it's a minor section of the player base. We're going to have a similar sort of thing existing in the middle of this trade league as a result of this change. The second major change that's happening, and this is lower in importance, but is still pretty significant. The Orb of Unravelling had been tested by players and had been discovered that it was able to upgrade crafted modifiers into higher tier versions of themselves. This is also getting patched, so this is no longer going to be the case. There's a number of things in PathOfExile where there's an interaction that players discover work a certain way, and we just have no idea whether it's intended or not because grinding games don't really provide that sort of documentation. To take one example here, there is a harvest craft that allows you to turn a fire resistance modifier into a comparable level lightning resistance modifier. How is this going to work if you use it on a set of gloves that have the incursion exclusive modifier 46 to 48% fire resistance and additional damage to burning enemies? Well, players have tested this and they've discovered that if you do use this craft on that, then it will change it into the lightning incursion modifier that's quite similar. However, I don't think that that's something that players should necessarily expect would always work that way. It's just what we've tested and what we've discovered is the way that it works. Well, we tested the Orb of Unravelling, it worked a certain way. Then Grinding Games has said, okay, that's far different to what we'd anticipated, and as a result, we're going to intervene on this one. There's a fair bit of precedent for this, and there's also precedent for things being left around until the end of the league. To take one example of a precedent where there was a change that was made that was very high impact to an existing crafting method, I want to talk about when the Awakener's Orb was introduced. When the Awakener's Orb was introduced, it respected meta mods on the item that was reforged. So you would click item 1, you'd click item 2, item 2 would be reforged, it would take an item from the donor modifier from item 1, and it would also keep any modifiers that were protected by meta mods that were on item 2. This was hotfixed out within a week of the Awakening Orb going live, and there were a number of items that were created during that week that could not be replicated until patch 3.18 came along and introduced recombinators. At that point, those items were able to be created, but some of the influence mods by then had gone legacy. So there's a number of items that realistically the only time you could ever make them was during that first week. There was also another example that I can think of where a crafting orb had its functionality changed after Grinding Games thought something was a bug. This was a Tainted Divine Teardrop. When it was introduced in Scourge League, there was a narrow window, and this one was very narrow, where you could use it to elevate a modifier from tier 1 influence mod pool up to the tier 0 Maven Orb exclusive. Nowadays we'd call that Orb of Dominance exclusive to that modifier tier. So that was something that could be done with a Tainted Divine Teardrop. Now, even with how rare Tainted Divine Teardrops are, that was not Grinding Games' intention. But players had tested the orb and found out that was the way it worked. So, essentially, there's a bit of a precedent for this happening, but it's pretty rare. And most of the time that a craft works in a counterintuitive way, it's left in place. For example, some of those incursion shenanigans that we're talking about with harvest resist swaps. Anyways, the Orb of Unravelling is getting a mid-league nerf. This is going to mean that all crafting done with Orbs of Unravelling for the rest of the league is going to be weaker than crafts that have been done in the last few days. Again, this is going to have a big impact, but probably less so than the 8 modifier corruption outcome is going to have, because all of the best maps that will ever be run in 3.26, all of them have now already been created. Now, all of this then flows into the video that I put out yesterday my time, but probably today for a lot of you, on the Trade League economy and how it had been really shaken up by the shift from tier 17s to tier 16.5s. This is going to partially undo that. Actually, I think the market's already overcorrected a bit. There was a big panic selling of Divine Orbs in response to this news. And the last I checked, the Divine Orb to Chaos Orb ratio had actually gone back under 190. I don't think that's going to hold. I think it will still end up that it'll be more than 200 once everything settles, but the shift away from tier 17s and into tier 16.5s is going to be ameliorated by this change. I do think we are still going to see a decreased demand for tier 17 re-rolling as a result of all the changes we've seen here. It's just that it's going to be a slower and more measured change than what was the case yesterday. Anyways, whole to go through there. This is definitely going to be a controversial patch. There will be people who hate it. There'll be people who love it. And it'll be very interesting to see how this goes and how it compares to the results when Grinding Gear Games made the exact opposite choice in Phrecia League, and it led to a huge exodus from that event. I'm going to leave it there. May your cartography scarabs of corruption have interesting results, and please don't use a Varlob on your patch notes.